Imagine you're 4 hours into your watch. It's 1700, you're on a merchant ship somewhere in the Atlantic, and the nearest land is 1,000 miles behind you. The oldest sailor on board, 30 years at sea, has been staring at the horizon all morning. High, thin clouds curling like feathers. A long, slow swell rolling in from the west, ahead of any wind. He knows exactly what that means. And by evening, so do you. Because then the wind arrives. Not a squall, a hard, screaming, wave-flattening wind that doesn't stop. It blows all night, then all the next day. Then it gets stronger. So now you can't cook because an open flame on a wooden ship in a storm is suicide. You can't sleep because the ship is tilting 30 degrees each way and the hull is groaning like something alive. You can't run because there is nowhere to run to. And the water is already coming in, not over the deck, through the ship itself. Every joint in the hull flexes with every wave, and every flex lets the ocean in, drop by drop by drop, into the darkness at the bottom of the ship. You're not scared of the storm anymore. You're in a race with it. For most of the age of sail, a storm wasn't bad weather. It was a 5-day fight for your life against an opponent that never gets tired. And what sailors actually did during that fight might be the most impressive thing humans have ever done on water. Today, a storm at sea is a notification on your phone. Flights delayed. Maybe your ferry gets cancelled and you're annoyed. And here's the funny part. Tonight, millions of people will open YouTube, type in ocean storm sounds, and fall asleep to it. 10 straight hours of howling wind and crashing waves playing softly in a warm bedroom. For you, the sound of a storm at sea is relaxation. For a sailor in 1700, that exact same sound could kill him in 3 different ways before it stopped. The first one is the water below. Here's the thing almost nobody understands about wooden ships. Waves almost never sink them directly. A wooden hull is shockingly tough and it wants to float. What kills ships is water getting inside faster than men can get it out. It collects in the bilge at the very bottom. The ship sits lower, she rises slower. The next wave hits harder and lets in more. It's a spiral, and at the bottom of that spiral, the ship simply stops coming back up. The second one is your own ship. A cannon weighs about 2 tons. In a storm, if its ropes fail, it becomes a battering ram rolling loose inside your own hull, crushing men, smashing planks, punching holes below the waterline. Sailors feared a loose gun more than they feared enemy fire. That's literally where the phrase comes from, a loose cannon. And above your head, it's no better. Torn sails flogging themselves to ribbons, snapped spars falling from 50 feet up, whole masts going over the side and dragging the ship down sideways. And the third one, maybe the worst, is the slow one, cold and exhaustion. The galley fire is out and stays out, so no hot food, no hot drink, no way to dry anything for days. Your clothes stay soaked, your skin cracks with salt, and you work. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock, until men start falling asleep standing up, holding a rope. And if a wave takes an exhausted man over the side, he's gone. The water is cold enough to kill in minutes, and the ship physically cannot turn around to look for him. Every man on board knows this. Nobody says it out loud. If you want to know what that adds up to, look at one night in history. In November 1703, a single storm hit the south of England. By morning, the Royal Navy had lost 13 warships and around 8,000 sailors were dead. One storm, one night. So the storm compressed a sailor's entire world down to one wooden box and a handful of jobs. And in the middle of all of it, one job mattered more than everything else: keeping the water out. The pumps. A ship's pump is a wooden shaft running down into the bilge, worked by hand. On bigger ships, a chain pump, a loop of chain with plates on it, cranked by 4 to 6 men, and a good crew could throw about a ton of water over the side every single minute. Which sounds impressive until you realise the ocean doesn't take breaks. So the men worked in short, brutal shifts, 20, 30 minutes, because that's all a human body could give at full effort. Then the next men stepped in, around the clock, for 5 days. Sailors had a phrase for it that needs no translation: pump or drown. But here's what's easy to miss. The battle wasn't actually won at the pumps. It was won before the storm ever arrived, in those few hours after the old man looked at the sky. The crew took the big sails in early and left only small, tough scraps of canvas, because in storm wind, a full sail doesn't drive a ship. It dismasts her. They sealed every hatch with boards and tarred canvas. Battened down, another phrase you still use. They lashed every gun with rope after rope after rope. And they stretched lifelines along the deck, waist high, because the first rule of storm survival fit into one sentence: one hand for yourself, one hand for the ship. Preparation, not courage. That was the trick. Courage was just what you needed when preparation ran out. All right, so the pumps are holding, the ship is sealed, and you cannot leave. What do you do for 5 days? You work, because here's what nobody tells you about a wooden ship in a storm. It's a machine that is constantly breaking. And the crew wasn't just a crew. It was a floating workshop. The sailmaker sat cross-legged on the lower deck with a leather palm strapped to his hand, driving a needle through canvas so heavy it could stand up on its own, rebuilding the exact sails the storm was destroying above him. The carpenter crawled through the dark hull with a lantern, tapping planks, listening for the dull sound of rot or the hiss of a new leak, hammering oakum, tarred rope fibers, into every seam that opened. Crews even developed a trick for serious holes called fothering. You take a spare sail, thread it under the ship on ropes, and let the water pressure suck the canvas into the hole from outside. A cloth patch applied to the outside of a ship from the deck in the middle of the ocean. That actually worked. That's how the age of sail stayed afloat. And the young sailors? A 5-day storm was their university. Knots that hold under load. How to move on a tilting deck. How to read the sea. 30 years of dead men's lessons passed hand to hand, because out here, the tuition for learning something the hard way was your life. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because the crew wasn't just fixing the ship, they were singing. The oldest written record of it is from 1549, a Scottish text that describes sailors hauling a rope while chanting in rhythm, call and response. And that rhythm wasn't decoration. 40 men pulling one rope accomplish nothing unless they pull at the same instant. And a song is a synchronization machine. The lead voice calls, everyone answers, and on the answer, everyone pulls. But it did something else too, something the men themselves probably couldn't have explained. It is very, very hard to feel doomed while you're singing. The storm screams. 40 voices answer it. In a fight you cannot win with strength. That might be worth more than strength. And when the watch ended and men dropped into their hammocks— by the way, the hammock itself is a piece of borrowed genius. European sailors took it from the peoples of the Caribbean, and it solved sleeping in a storm completely, because when the ship rolls, a hanging bed stays level while the whole world swings around it. When men lay there, packed shoulder to shoulder, they talked. Stories, superstitions, explanations. If a storm went on long enough, sailors sometimes saw something impossible. Cold blue fire, glowing silently on the tips of the masts. When Magellan's fleet hit weeks of storms in 1519, his chronicler wrote that the crew saw that light and wept with relief. To them it was Saint Elmo himself, standing on the mast, promising the ship would live. Today we know it's corona discharge, electricity leaking off sharp points in a charged storm sky. But notice what that story did. It took the most terrifying moment of a sailor's life and turned it into a promise. Every sea culture on Earth built storm myths, storm saints, storm omens, rats leaving a ship, whistling that summons wind. And those stories weren't stupidity, they were survival psychology, invented by people sitting inside the exact nightmare the story was trying to tame. And this is the part that genuinely blows my mind. Storms didn't just create myths, they created law. Think about the moment the captain orders the cargo thrown overboard. The ship is too heavy, water is gaining, so the crew starts heaving the entire point of the voyage. Someone's goods, someone's fortune, into the sea. Ship survives. Now, who pays for that? The merchant whose crates went over the side, while his neighbor's crates arrived safe. Over 2,000 years ago, the traders of the ancient Mediterranean settled it with a rule so fair it's still in maritime law today. If cargo is sacrificed to save the ship, everyone shares the loss. Everyone. Your goods survived only because someone else's drowned, so you owe him a share. Storms wrote that rule, and it has now outlived every empire that ever enforced it. But here's the part nobody talks about. A storm wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was the best thing that could happen to a ship. First, speed. A sailing ship running before a storm, under scraps of canvas, was covering more ocean than she ever could in fair weather. Days of distance gained in hours. Captains hated storms and quietly loved what storms did to the logbook. Second, water. On a long voyage, the thing that limited survival was almost never food. It was fresh water, rotting green in barrels, rationed by the cup. And a storm was a reservoir falling out of the sky. Crews rigged sails and awnings into giant funnels and channeled rain straight into empty barrels. 5 days of storm could mean weeks of drinking water. The same monster trying to sink you was also refilling your supply. And third, and this one changed the world, storms drew the map. In 1488, the Portuguese captain Bartolomeu Dias was pushed south by a storm so violent it carried his ships, blind, clean around the southern tip of Africa, the corner Europeans had been trying to find for generations. He named it the Cape of Storms. His king, seeing what it opened, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. And the ocean road to India was born from 13 days of bad weather. Some of the most important discoveries in the age of sail happened to crews who were simply trying to survive being somewhere they never meant to go. So, what did sailors do when a storm lasted 5 days? Everything that mattered. They pumped a ton of water a minute and refused to fall behind. They patched sails below deck while the storm shredded sails above it. They pressed cloth against the outside of the hull using the ocean's own pressure. They sang in rhythm, because rhythm was strength, and strength was life. They wrapped their terror in saints and omens so it could be carried. They threw fortunes into the sea and then invented a law fair enough to survive 20 centuries. And when it was over, they sat down among the wreckage, fixed everything, and sailed on. Not because they were fearless, fear was the ocean's whole point. But panic is a luxury, and it does not exist on a ship where survival depends on what 60 exhausted men do with their hands in the next 4 hours. So they worked, storm after storm, century after century. They turned the most violent thing on the planet into a routine, a checklist, a rhythm, a system strong enough to hand to the next boy who came aboard knowing nothing. And that might be the single biggest reason the Age of Sail worked at all. But here's the strange thing. Ask an old sailor what he feared more than any storm, and he wouldn't say bigger waves. He'd say silence. No wind, none at all, for 3 weeks. A ship that cannot move under a sun that will not blink, while the water in the barrels drops lower every single day. That is the next video.